Welcome, adventurer, to another episode of Critical Review. I'm Arlyeon.
And I'm Sean. And today we will be diving into the depths of Castle Torgeath.
Descent into darkness!
Yeah, that. So, Torgeath is a first-person RPG dungeon crawler by indie team Dungeoneering Studios, with some definite signs of retro inspiration.
Lethal traps, scrounging for food and resources so you don't starve or simply perish due to attrition and a lack of healing potions, and extremely large dungeon floors patrolled by vile vermin and vicious, villainous, Undead. Yes. Undead. Though not any of the type who want to suck your blood.
That was bad. I mean, all puns are bad, but that was especially bad even for you. You should feel ashamed. But yes, these elements are all part of Castle Torgeath's experience. That said, are they enough to make braving the journey to the bottom of the castle worthwhile? Or will the experience turn out to be somehow worse than Arlyeon's puns? Find out now! Castle Torgeath is a dungeon crawler, and as such, the act of exploring the game's titular dungeon is the core mechanic. You're not going to find an open world experience here like you might get out of games like Elder Scrolls, or even a semi-open world game like Diablo. But oftentimes with games of this nature, you don't really need an expansive overworld. You can expect lots of narrow passageways and dimly lit rooms, all of which are haunted by a variety of monsters eager to make you into a light snack. You're dropped into the game with little fanfare, armed with nothing more than a sword, a fireball spell, and your wits. This will be where you probably encounter the first element that the game tries to use to set itself apart. There is no loot in Castle Torgeath, not in the traditional sense. The most you're going to find for much of the game is junk and food. One is for eating, and the other serves as the game's vendor currency. I'll let you decide which is which.
Junk food! Though, to correct you here, Sean, there is actually a form of loot, just not in the enemies exploded into loot piñatas and better equipment kind. Rather, between the heaps of apples, candlesticks, broken weapons, and other odds and ends, you'll occasionally find crystals, ingots of treasure, swords made of gold, and other odds and ends which have a value in gold pieces, which are used to barter with one of the two vendor types in the game. There is totally air quotes around that, by the by, since vendors come in two distinct kinds. The first type you encounter are the NPCs who have a limited number of items they will offer you, health and mana potions typically, in exchange for items of an equivalent gold value. The second type, and the one you're more likely to be visiting again and again, is the buff vendor. This vendor is an ethereal looking and haloed dude who you can find frequently sitting in one or two places on a dungeon floor, where he offers you an exchange of power in the form of one of 3 temporary, we're talking like 10 minutes, buffs, which come in the flavor of double melee damage, double magic damage, or half damage taken. His price is the interesting part, as a certain quantity of the junk items you've hopefully been filling your inventory with, vis-a-vis putting your Skyrim level kleptomania skills to use on the dungeon. There's plot reasons behind this whole thing, like involving his resurrection or something in the ilk, but I wasn't really sure how that set of forks was going to help him rise from the grave. I was more concerned with killing things in half the time. And man, that is a major concern with this game, because like me and Sean mentioned, there's a rather distinct lack of lootable weapons, with the few upgrades to your physical and magical arsenal arriving either vis-a-vis interactions with NPCs at sparse, fixed intervals, or happening upon one of the few spells scattered throughout the game. I found all the weapons, but I was unsure if the 2 alternate spells I found were the only ones available, but they're still few and far between.
Right. Most of your experience in the halls of Castle Torgeath are going to be spent hoarding everything you come across. Everything. If it isn't nailed down, you will be picking up every single fork, stale piece of bread and rusty sword you come across.
I mean, at least until you run out of inventory space. Thankfully, everything does seem to weigh an identical value of 1, and you have 300 slots. But obsessive-compulsive borrowing will see that quickly fill up.
This brings us to the next major issue that we have with this game. Part of the joy of an RPG is trying to find new and exciting ways to manipulate your stat build. Without gear, your ability to build specific types of characters, be it tanks, spellflingers, sneaky backstabbers, what have you, is all severely limited by the simple fact that aside from the moment that the game decides it's time for you to get a new weapon, or you manage to hunt down one of those new spells, there's not any equipment to be had. So you have to rely on level ups alone to get those precious stat boosts. You have your usual array of stats to choose from, the stuff that increases magic, health, physical damage, and speed. Here's the thing though, there's no goddamn point in putting points in anything but HP and magic. None.
And here's why. It takes well into the, we'll say, 3rd floor before you even get a ranged weapon, and a fairly limited amount of ammo for them. Even worse, there's not actually a buff from the vendor which amplifies their damage. He's melee only, baby. And sure, whilst there's some degree of utility in the movement speed Dex can provide, health is infinitely more useful because it scales up max health and how long it takes for you to starve. But Arlie, what about strength?
Oh, please tell me about strength. I'm at the edge of my seat here. I have to know. What joys do a sword enthusiast get to look forward to?
Oh, you really want to know? Welp, whilst it's certainly a faster form of attacking than magic, it does approximately half the damage, and the resulting trade of blows will generally drain your reserve of health potions. Feeling-wise, all of the melee weapons are fairly similar in how they function in combat, mace, sword, axe, with one being better at either overhand, thrusts, or swings. Worse, the game has a particularly vicious mechanic in play where weird blue fog infests the body of something you recently killed, of which the chances heighten as you murder more things and resets upon triggering, and uses that body that you just murdered to summon a demon. Not only are these things fairly damaging and have a hefty amount of health compared to anything else on the floor, they're also physical immune. Completely physically immune, so you can't do damage to them with your mace, with your ranged attacks. The only thing that you can do is try and burn them down with magic spells. Oh, and they're generally as fast as you, if not more, and equipped with such lovely abilities as messing with your screen as you descend further into the castle, since they continue to escalate in difficulty, and one of them even has the ability to block. So essentially they just laugh at you and beat you into goo if you've already run out of MP. So essentially game over. And on the subject of magic, by the way, well, magic spells start out doing around twice as much damage as melee, which gets astronomical with the spell vendor's buff, and have at least 2 upgraded forms in the dungeon which grant you the ability to decimate whatever's in front of you so long as you have the MP to whip out those upgraded floors. Which means you can safely murder a room of creatures in a fraction of the time melee can without needing to spend any health potions. Moreover, it's the only form of projectile which replenishes itself as you recover small amounts of MP over time, and every point in the magic stat gives you another 2 shots of the basic spell and makes it more powerful.
There's really no downside to making a pure magic build, whereas trying to build for physical damage will see you at a stark disadvantage when you have to face down those physical immune enemies. And you might ask, yeah, well, what about the mana bars? Yeah, well, what about them? Each floor is so tiresomely labyrinthian that you will have plenty of time to regenerate mana in between each encounter with an enemy and really reflect on what you're doing with your life. Which leads further into the ultimate issue that we have with this game. It's so tediously boring. You'll spend so much time wandering around each floor's hallways, which are painfully vacant at times, wondering, where do I go? What do I do? This point is further driven home because unlike most dungeon crawlers, the floor plans are static. They don't change. So when you die, you're forced to go back to your last save and redo the same slog through those long, empty hallways that you just did. It feels so just joyless. Nothing about playing this game inspired me with those feelings of adventure. It's just, oh good, another hallway. Oh good, another buff vendor selling the same vaguely useful crap the last one was peddling. Oh good, 3 more of those spiders I just spent the last goddamn hour killing! Why am I here?
Ooh, a key. Now to... oh, right. Backtrack through all of those halls again. Fuck. I mean, on the bright side, whilst there is a hunger meter, it doesn't go down unfairly fast, so it's not like I'm just going to fall over dead in the middle of, like, generic looking hallway number 413, but at the same time, it's not like I've ever really felt hard-pressed about food in this game. It's everywhere, and I think that just might be another gripe that I have with the game. Its normal mode felt easy. It has a starvation mechanic, but not really used to its fullest extent. Food doesn't spoil, for instance. The random appearance of the fog monsters can be harrowing, but the normal monsters were just more of a nuisance than a challenge, especially since they seemed fairly vulnerable to just strafing around them and stabbing them. Oh, and there's not a large variety of them, which also means you're going to learn the nuances of them fairly quickly. What's more, whilst the traps can be interesting to navigate around at first, and they can be flippin' lethal, the lack of randomness means you can just save scum and avoid them. Oh, and when I mention normal mode, it's because this game does have a hard and rogue mode, with the latter deleting your save file if you die. Yay. Oh, but it can be slightly broken, because if you started after beating the game, you start with your max level character and their the current inventory that you had when you beat the game, just as an FYI. So yeah, exploits for the win if you want an easy achievement for clearing rogue or hard mode.
Yeah, there is a harder difficulty, but man, I had no enthusiasm left to even bother with it. The core game was such a tiresome experience that I had to just stop. If you really want to have a go at it, it's weirdly hidden in the option menu. Have fun, or don't. I don't care anymore. Wait, there was a story? Okay, yeah, there is a story here, but the game was so mechanically boring that I honestly missed most of it because I just didn't care. I've said it time and time again, and I'll say it again here. I'm all about gameplay over story. You know, I hate those long drawn out cutscenes and stuff. And I love how lore is presented in games like Dark Souls. That incentive to explore and read everything. In Torgeath, a lot of the lore is presented in the same fashion. Notes, journals, NPCs, stuff like that. The problem is, whereas a game like Dark Souls is fun and engaging to play, Castle Torgeath just isn't. So the reward of lore for exploration falls flat. I had no desire to explore after a certain point. I did not care what was in that room over there, because I had already seen that room up 10 million times. I just wanted to be done, and because of that, I missed a lot of story. As a reviewer who really respects the craft, it really leaves a bad taste in my mouth to say that, but after everything, I just couldn't be bothered.
Surprisingly, I didn't mind the story of Torgeath. I actually played through to the end of the game and pieced together pretty much everything I cared to know, and it was one of the aspects of the game that I actually didn't find too bad. Whether it was via petty notes, historical texts, theories on how magic works in the world, journals, or other good stuff, I found this aspect of the game the least tedious, and though there's also a few brief automatic cutscenes of sort, they're blissfully skippable. Basically, if you die, you can click right through that scene, since it basically just functions like dialogue with an NPC. And yes, there's NPCs, but they're fairly few and far between. Though I think this might be tied to the fact that character-wise, the only people you really get to know are a small group of friendly orc cultists, seriously. Then pretty much everyone else is either a straggler who fills in some sort of backstory because they're like part of this expedition you're following, the buff vendor, an evil demon, or they're fucking dead and you're just finding the remnants of their corpse. That kind of thing sorta does cut down on NPC conversation chains, let me tell ya. Still, between those scenes, the various scribblings, and the conversations you can normally hold with those NPCs, including the various vendor ones, you'll be able to glean a fair amount of backstory. Plot-wise, it's not the most convoluted or tricky storyline, but it's not bad either. It's just paced out somewhat awkwardly, given the sheer amount of walking you end up doing. And no, despite throwing tons of junk at the buff vendor, I never saw a resolution to his plight. He's forever a ghosty, no matter how many forks I throw at him. I mean, graphically, I'd probably think of Elder Scrolls Oblivion in terms of dungeon textures and enemies.
Don't you think that's giving this game a little too much credit?
Look, man, Oblivion wasn't that impressive, but, you know, fine, we'll say it's not Oblivion on maxed out settings. There, that's our compromise. Anyways, it doesn't look bad. Though you are going to be slightly hard-pressed for variety in enemy design because we're talking dogs, giant rats, a lot of different skeleton types, a bunch of orc types, and a bunch of demons. The demons actually are the most distinctive enemy variety. The bosses themselves tend to just be bigger variants of normal monsters, so again, less impressive, more sorta old-schooly.
Graphically, I feel like I understand what they were going for. It was supposed to look low-res. It was supposed to invoke memories of the old DOS dungeon crawler games or the first couple of Elder Scrolls games. The problem is those games looked way better and were made with technology that is leaps and bounds less advanced than what game developers have access to today. And I mentioned before the labyrinthian hallways. Yeah, those aren't doing this game any favors. The seemingly endless expanse of corridors really serves to drive home the point that, man, I just didn't enjoy looking at this game.
Essentially, you're going to get a very distinct sense of sameness, since the floors, like the first and second floors, are essentially using similar textures. The third and fourth floors use similar text floors, and the fifth and sixth floors, yup, they use similar textures. And yes, I get a sort of like, you've entered this zone type deal. And you start to associate those walls and props and everything with the enemies and everything else that particular region of the dungeon contains. But I felt it was relatively plain, save for a few neat details here and there. Like, while I was traveling through the mines, there was a swarm of bats that were like rising up towards the ceiling. Some of the items that you could use, like the forge items inside, they do nothing other than just look pretty and light up, but that's a little neat detail. And I think there's also this horrible ritual I did on one of the final floors that was totally optional and filled the room with an awful black smoke and fucked with my screen. So, you know, there's interesting moments here and there that were fairly spaced out, but it's just between long bouts of predictable walking and samey graphics. Actually, although again, to go on neat things, while walking through the mines, there's this aspect of the screen vibrating a bit as dust crumbles from the ground and you hear an ominous rumbling, and it gives this nice feeling of like, oh, I'm in an unstable, like, mine passage. That was nice. That was a very nice detail, and it helped sort of break up the monotony of walking, except for the fact that you could very well tell that it was triggered by you being in that hallway, since it wasn't random. If you walked out of that hallway, it would stop. If you walked back in, it would start again. And I was like, oh.
I want you to imagine every generic medieval sounding tune you've ever heard. Every bad made-for-TV movie set in a fantasy setting. Every bargain bin DOS game set in a castle. Got that in your head? Good. That's pretty much all this game offers in terms of music. The soundtrack might have worked back in the day when MIDI and chiptunes were all we had to work with. But even then, I started off a long list of NES games that sounded way better.
Okay, harsh there. It's not quite bargain bin, but yeah, generic medieval ambience would be a good and while for some level you get the intentional, given that's meant to very flat during the boss fights. I actually murdered a boss without even realizing it was one. Normal combat music, used a few blasts of magic, and bam! Combat done! And then an achievement popped, and I was like, oh, that was a boss encounter.
Intentional or not, it just serves to drive home that feeling of tedium and boredom that this game is already filled to the brim with. After all this, you can probably tell that I did not enjoy this game. And I'm aware that it might come off as me being maybe a little bit needlessly militant in my stance against the game. The thing is, I adore dungeon crawlers. They are my bread and butter. I love the feeling of conquering a dungeon after many hard-fought battles. Hell, dungeon crawling is the main reason that I am such an avid MMO player. And games like Elder Scrolls, Dungeonhack, Wizardry, Eye of the Beholder, anything that lets me dive headfirst into a dungeon. Man, I just love them. So it makes it very frustrating for me when I am presented with a game that does it as poorly as Castle Torgeath has. I wanted to like this game. When I received my copy of it, I immediately installed and started playing. I didn't hesitate. And by the second floor, I felt like I was done playing. It took my favorite type of video game and turned it into a chore. There was no joy. I felt no sense of accomplishment. Just floor after floor of mindless walking. I honestly can't say I would recommend this game to anyone.
So, as per normal, I have done my best to highlight the various aspects of the game, both good and bad. I try to play devil's advocate because I feel it's only fair. And honestly, like Sean, I do enjoy a good dungeon crawl. I enjoyed Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 the first bunch of times I ran it. I enjoy Barony. I liked the original Rogue. There was a Might and Magic game that was pretty dungeon crawly that I enjoyed, and for an example of more indie trash, I liked Paper Sorcerer. But as much as I try and be forgiving towards Castle Torgeath, what I ended up feeling was that this was sort of a slow-paced mashup between a walking simulator and a dungeoneering expedition. As a game that desired to evoke a degree of ambience and tension, I feel that it failed at that, as the predictability of the journey clashed with the dungeon crawling aspects and the tension building aspect, and subjected us to too many long-winded hallways with no map to be found and no payoff at the end. On the walking simulator aspect, I found that whilst the lore itself was well written, the world also wasn't able to draw me in given just the long, monotonous bouts. Unlike Sean, I slogged through the game from start to finish, and I don't feel that the end of that particular journey justified the time spent. There were interesting ideas mechanically, but nothing that really stood out or really brought anything new to the table beyond a somewhat tedious experience. Though, at least the last boss did change up the formula for earlier encounters and killed me a handful of times. I will give it that. Nonetheless, I would agree with Sean and say that this game more than just fumbled. It failed in what it was endeavoring to do. Not critically, to its credit. System-wise, it is still very much a functional game. But it's not one that I took any great enjoyment out of. And at the end of the day, when a game stops feeling like a game, when it stops being fun, that says enough.